Hello and welcome to Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube, and Nima of economicsjunkie.com. We are here to tackle ideas, both ancient and modern, in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com, and this is going to be our 27th episode, Environmentalism, Austerity Through the Back Door. So, we left our last episode, which was how to criticize MMT, actually talking about austerity, and one of the things that came up, and we had a lovely Nima rant about this, as we usually do, which are great, is that environmentalism, or what's packaged as environmentalism, or climate change, or global warming, or whatever we want to call it, being green, is really just another form of austerity. Where austerity, on the economic sense, from particularly from the MMT viewpoint, is simply a situation where there aren't enough spending tokens, or tax tokens, or dollars, or money, or whatever we're calling it, within an economic system for everybody to buy everything, and for everybody to be, what's the word I want? Not successful, I guess successful, and stable, and have your basic needs met, or I guess even beyond that, at least be middle class. And if the government, which we understand is the sole issuer of a currency, or at least we're talking about the United States, there's different problems in different parts of the world, like the Eurozone. The individual governments there do not have sovereign control over their currency. Because they issue the currency, and then they demand it as a tax, it only makes sense that they have to give their subjects, I mean, I know I'm talking about this in kind of feudal terms, they have to give their subjects an opportunity to get the tax, or get the token that they have to pay the tax with, and if they don't, that's austerity. Would you say it more technically, or is that simple enough? I mean, we've hit it a million times on the show so far, but I feel like the more we could boil it down to a simple mode, the better.
Yeah, I think imposing a level of taxation that causes the private sector to shrink, causes the economy to shrink, I would say is probably the easiest way to define it. And you said you're putting it in feudal terms, but it's not necessarily false, because as we discussed last time, austerity, in a sense, has been used to colonize Africa. For example, when the Brits went to South Africa and needed people to work the mines, they would just impose a tax in a currency that they made up, or maybe even in pounds or whatever. And suddenly all the people who were living in a sort of self-sustained lifestyle had to work for that money to be able to pay the tax. And in many cases, they would just be thrown out of their huts, or discriminated against in other ways. But definitely, I mean, not allowing the private sector to grow comfortably, and that's obviously hard to quantify, but imposing a level of taxation that doesn't allow the private sector to grow comfortably, I would say that's clearly a form of austerity. And the tool that is used to impose this type of austerity is money, of course.
Well, and then you said it's hard to quantify, and I think that's a good thing to point out, where there are a lot of details to this outside this simple explanation that we're giving, where you could say, okay, how is that money being introduced into the system, and how are people being allowed to use it? That is a very good thing to bring up, but before we can even talk about that, the money has to be there. Like there has to be credits for people to work with. There has to be something to trade before we can even talk about the details of what's going on. The thing to quantify of what exactly is the best way to do this. But if we just take that away and we get austerity, then nobody's doing anything.
Right. I think probably the easiest way to quantify is just if you allow for full employment, you don't let anyone in the private sector be unemployed.
Now,
and that would entail a job guarantee, obviously, as we've discussed before, or a transition job program.
Correct.
Yeah.
Now, on the flip side of that, because we were talking about environmentalism here a second ago, and at the end of the last episode, it's one thing to talk about on the economic side that, okay, we need enough tokens in the economic sandbox for everybody to be able to play along. However, if we don't allow anybody to do anything with those tokens that we've given them, you essentially get the same thing.
Yeah, it's not financial austerity, but it's regulatory imposed austerity.
Right? So if you're not allowed to build here because of the fish, or you can't start this business because of you got to pay your carbon tax, or you can't drive a car because of you get taxed per mile now, or blah, all this sort of stuff, guised under, it's good for the environment, which it isn't, which I'm sure we're going to have.
Bullshit.
It's bullshit. Well, we could briefly hit that again. All it does is say, okay, you're not allowed to do anything with the money that we've given you, or supplied, that the government has supplied for their subjects. And, it's frustrating for people like me and Nima when we're seeing the majority of the MMT crowd, which are leftists. I mean, we got to be honest. And they're backing this Green New Deal bullshit from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I don't think it's not from her. She was fed it like all congressmen are fed their damn bills. Because I'd seen people talking about it long before Ocasio-Cortez was around. And they're up and down about, okay, we need to have this federal job guarantee, and we got to, do all this renewable energy, and we need to stop cars and stop planes and stop cow farts. God. Didn't it actually say cow farts in the bill? Stop breathing. Stop all this sort of stuff. And it's like, guys,
already,
this is exactly the austerity you're harping on the fiscally conservative politicians for causing.
Yeah, and it's going to be imposed at the end of the day. It's going to be another financial austerity program, because, as you alluded to earlier, that there's going to be a carbon tax. There already is carbon tax in many countries around the world. France just tried to raise their fuel tax, which is essentially their way to impose a carbon tax, and people went ballistic.
Good for them.
And you had the whole yellow vest movement. And they're going to do it again and again and again. They're going to keep prodding society into this hellish austerity where nobody can own a farm anymore. Nobody can
own a car. Speaking of owning cars,
oil machines.
What's on the books for us in Washington, or what's at least being attempted to be rammed through, on top of an income tax it's attempted to be rammed through. Washington state is one of the rare states in the country that doesn't have a personal tax return. Only the businesses pay taxes here, because most of the tax revenue here is gotten through sales tax. But our governor, Jay Inslee, who has recently thrown in his hat into the presidential run with his core campaign being for climate change, has been pushing for a pay per mile car tax in the state of Washington, where I guess you're supposed to when you renew your tabs every year or something, you have to give your mileage and they charge you for your fucking mileage or something, a tax. This is exactly the sort of stuff that we're talking about, where it's got nothing to do with the environment.
Yeah, it's a
punishment.
And all the bullshit that's being proposed to supposedly help the environment, it's really just a shakedown. It's really just a way to make people conform and to scare the crap out of people. And those who don't pay attention are just gonna fall for it and support it and attack those who have questions and are skeptical. And people are being prosecuted, or at least there were a couple of attempts made to prosecute Exxon executives for lying about climate change, supposedly, and that lawsuit didn't go so well and it was actually, I believe it was filed in San Francisco, the Ninth Circuit, and it was just, from what I read, at least the first attempt, it was pretty pathetic, and the judge wasn't very impressed with the prosecution, because they're really trying to impose fines and probably at the end of the day throw you in jail if you disagree with their climate change cult religion. And they're just trying little things like this stunt with this suit, and I'm sure there'll be more of that down the road. And they just keep testing the waters, France just tried that fuel tax, and people weren't having it, so they're going to probably have a smaller tax, and then a smaller tax on top, and then some more on top, and
the totalitarian tiptoe, my favorite.
It's just this exactly this whole freak out campaign is in full force, while everything that they're basing it on is unproven and false and made up. And it doesn't bother them. They just keep going and going and going. And that's the markings of a cult or a religion.
Well,
if you think about the Catholic the Catholic concept of original sin, to say that we're breathing and we're destroying the earth and we need to pay taxes for that, which is what all this carbon freak-out cult leads to, that's kind of like a version of original sin. That's a form of Puritanism. It's a form of control, and it has nothing to do with saving the environment.
Well, and then I actually wanted to take that a level deeper. We were chatting about this earlier today. So we could spend our time here going over how stupid the climate change / environmental movement / global warming thing has been. And honestly, I think most of the people listening to this are pretty hip to that. One of the things I actually wanted to bring up was a level deeper, which was something I listened to from Peace Revolution podcast. And unfortunately, I'm super sorry, everyone. I can't remember which episode it was. However, the episode simply included a copy of a BBC or recording of a BBC documentary on the history of ecology. So if you want to look it up, that should be enough to get you to find it. And this was so fascinating. So apparently, and this is me pulling my memory up from listening to that episode, ecology was born sometime in the 50s when a British guy went to Africa, he was in Africa for some reason, and something that he saw in the environment there gave him the idea that everything in nature was in this perfect balance. And that if something tried to move nature out of that perfect balance, and by perfect balance, I'm talking like on the ecology level, like how different animals, predators eat prey, or lower animals eat plants, or when they defecate, that helps the plants grow, or when they die, the fungus eats it, and there's this this cycle of life, Lion King style, of how everything stays in this balance. That's what I mean by staying in balance. And that if anything happens to mess with that balance, as soon as that force, which is affecting the balance, is removed, the environment or the ecology will naturally return to that balanced state. Now, this is a hypothesis, and unfortunately for ecology, what they did with it was very unscientific, which instead of testing it, they took it and ran. And that documentary goes into that by the time we get into the 70s, when there's finally enough computing power to start running simulations on this sort of stuff, where ecologists started looking at analyzing individual bits of data of what was going on in a environment. And when I say that, I mean they were like tracking either elk or antelope or bison or something and watching what they were eating from. And the documentary even had a recording of the guy saying, 1 bite of alfalfa, 2 bites of grass, 1 bite of this other plant. And if he missed it, the guy would actually go over and open the animal's mouth and look in and see what the thing was eating.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And so they put all this stuff into the computer, and the first few times they did this, it slapped them in the face, because what the simulation ran was that things went wildly different. Like whatever they calculated the balance was, nothing ever went back to the balance, and they said, "Oh, well, we better get more data to prove this." And in the more and more data they got, the more and more it like removed itself from that balance. And to prove the point, the documentary brought up that there was an island that had no human interaction with it that caught on fire. And so the whole island burnt down. And so the assumption was, due to this ecological assumption that nature is in this perfect harmony, and if something affects it, it will go back to it as soon as that thing stops affecting it, is that the island should have returned to the ecological interactions that it was before, the same environment and vegetation and wildlife and stuff that it was before. Turned out it came back completely differently. It looked completely different. And of course, this totally makes sense if you just think about dinosaurs. And you think about all the fossils we dig up of all the animals that were here from the dinosaurs to what was it before the dinosaurs, like the Cambrian period, the pre-Cambrian period, up to the Ice Age where there's saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths and stuff. All these things are dead. Everything is just completely changed. Like continents that moved around. We've had continent-wide forest fires, comets hitting the earth, all this sort of stuff, and every time it comes back completely differently. And so the fundamental assumption, despite the fact that the evidence doesn't just not point at it, it completely points at the opposite, which is there is no balance of nature that the environment goes back to. What the environmentalist movement has extracted from this erroneous idea is that anything a human does, and this, like you were saying, this is the original sin. Anything a human does pushes nature out of that balance. And if humans would simply stop messing with nature, it would go back to its sacred balance and everything would be great again. But it's not true. There is this balance that this guy thought up way back when in the 50s, when on his trip to Africa, is completely false. So you can see this when you look at the way they talk about your carbon footprint. Oh, Nima, you left a footprint on the Earth.
Such a talking point.
Why is that bad?
Yeah.
What? And it's bad because there's this assumption that if you touched it because you're human, you screwed it up.
Well, it's a universe of words that the social engineers create that people just start living in, and they parrot those terms. And I read, I did a podcast about climate change a while ago. I guess we do a lot of those, huh? And
keeps coming back to it. It's just like,
right. People shut up about it, right?
Well, and then we're talking about austerity, which kind of controls everything. And like we're pointing out right now, there's two ways to get at it: financially and regulatory. And the regulatory monster that we're looking at is this fucking environmentalist bullshit.
Yeah, and it's going to be a regulatory plus financial, because they're going to tighten the grip on our purses through taxation. And like I said, we've seen that in France and didn't really go over well, but they'll keep coming at it. And now, as you've mentioned, it's going to come through the municipal and the state levels, because those are very well controlled by the globalist foundations and by the people who are basically behind the UN. As far as we can tell, at least, it seems like localities, counties, and states.
Agenda 21.
Yeah, pretty well controlled through Agenda 21, exactly.
Agenda 21. So, did you want to talk about that a little bit before? I was going to move on to the perfect balance equivalent in the economic realm.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Okay. So, because this just occurred to me, I'd say within the last week or so. So, when we're talking about this perfect balance, so we're talking about austerity, both in economics and in environmentalism / regulation. And when I noticed this idea of perfect balance in environmentalism, we also have this idea of this perfect balance in economics. And I think it actually goes back to the idea of the invisible hand from Adam Smith, where, and it goes a little bit something like this, which is that prices are what tell everybody how much something is worth. And through supply and demand, we, prices will adjust to show everybody, what resources are valuable and what resources aren't. And when the government comes in and starts taxing this and subsidizing that and regulating this over here and having government contracts for that over there and doing this project and that welfare and blah, 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 all this sort of stuff, the government is messing with the natural balance of the price structure. And if the government would just simply stop messing with the natural balance of the price structure, the invisible hand can go back to putting the prices exactly where they need to be in their natural balance. Now, I'm not saying I'm over here saying subsidies are great and taxes are great and government regulation is great and all these sort of things. I'm just pointing out that there's no evidence of this natural balance in economics either. And in fact, you brought up the religious connotation. As I found out from reading David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years, is that Adam Smith, he didn't write this in The Wealth of Nations. It was in a later book that I totally forgot the name of it. It was something to do with morals. Yeah,
he was he was a professor of ethics or something like that.
Something like that, yes. When he talked about his inspiration for the invisible hand, and what he said was he wanted a way to put providence into economics in a similar way that Isaac Newton had done with physics. Because we have a tendency to look at these hard sciences and say, okay, this is like a strong grounding for atheism. Well, the guys who originally came up with this stuff were definitely not atheists. And Isaac Newton, for example, took these incredible universal concepts in science. Well, I mean, his most famous one, F equals ma, for example, or the gravity formula, or the force of gravity formula, and said, look at the work of God. We are understanding the work of God through the scientific method in mathematics. Adam Smith wanted something similar to say, okay, I want this, how do I want to describe this universal formula, like F equals MA, inside my discipline that I've created, economics. And the invisible hand was his attempt at that. Of course, he didn't come up with a formula, but he did say, okay, there's the implication that this formula must exist if there's this natural balance that everything is going back to. Very similarly to like the calculations that the environmentalists were running in the 70s, saying, okay, if we put enough data into this computer, it should spit out that whatever the natural balance should be. This also leads to economic austerity. Or I should say, this leads to austerity, the economic variety, where we will hear this from the, in quotes, conservative side of the aisle. Actually, we just heard it from the liberal side of the aisle, too. We'll hear this from whatever side of the aisle is losing at the moment.
Well, we'll hear it from neoliberals and neocons, essentially.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. Is that we need to back off on the spending. We need to raise the taxes to get our budget under control and let things balance out.
Because it's like a household.
And we need to let things go back to the way that they, in quotes, should be. Again, this implication that there's this like natural balance of how prices should be floating at. And if the government would just stop messing with it, they would go back to normal. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a supply and demand, and there aren't supply and demand forces, and that prices don't indicate anything about the scarcity of resources. However, as we know, the government issues the currency before markets are made. So the primal act isn't the market using supply and demand to determine prices. The primal act is the government issuing currency to build a bridge or write someone's social security check or something. And then we can turn around and make a market out of it. So there's nowhere to... This natural balance can't exist if that's the primal act. Does that make... am I making sense to you, Nima?
Yeah. Yeah. The primal act being the imposition of the tax.
Yeah, like, I would almost even call that the zeroth act. Like, before we even do anything, we're going to impose a tax.
Right.
So, we're talking about austerity here. There's two ways to get there. And right now...
There's many ways to get there.
Oh, there's many ways to get there. I stand corrected. But there's two that we're talking about right now.
Right.
And because MMT is coming out, has been out, but I mean, the voice is growing and saying, okay, we need... austerity is essentially the worst economic sin that you can commit. Totally agreed. However, a lot of the MMT guys are introducing austerity through other means. And if we make the recognition that austerity is something to be avoided, and that having enough credits, having enough points, having enough tax tokens for everybody is simply a matter of making sure that there's enough there. This is a really simple solution. Again, I understand the details of how exactly to do it the best way could get complicated. But
but full employment, if you use that as the marker, that's pretty simple.
Yes.
If we demand a certain tax token, then nobody should be looking for work to get that token without being able to find that work. Yes. Because we're forcing them to pay taxes in it, yeah.
Yeah. And then if we're going to expect them to have any sort of... If we're going to expect them to create something or have any decent standard of living, we have to allow them to do something with those tax tokens.
Yeah.
And we can't just regulate them out of...
Well, and that's where we get to the our dear climate change freakout cult, that wants to tell us we can't have children anymore, we can't drive SUVs, can't have cows, can't do this, can't do that, can't have to pay extra for fuel, and that's just what ultimately boxes us into smaller and smaller confines of, well, we can't really do much anymore at one point, or we just have to pay a lot to do it, so only the wealthy can do it. And that's the dream world of the climate cultists, and including those who don't really know what the hell they're doing, don't have no clue where this is going to go ultimately. Those are, of course, the useful idiots. So should we read some more, maybe add some climate science, just as a little add-on?
I'll give you 2. You get 2 this time. That's it.
So this is the book, The Neglected Son, which was originally published in German, and I actually read the original version, but then lost it or forgot it on an airplane at one point.
Hope someone German found it.
Also, the airlines is lost and found. They're not serious people, it seems. They don't really help you. But this is written by Professor Fritz Fahrenhold, who's a German scientist, environmentalist, politician, and industrialist. With his initial doctorate in chemistry, Fahrenhold has researched at the Max Planck Institute for Carbon Research at Mülheim, blah, blah, blah. And the other guy is...
Whoa. That can't be true. All scientists agree that climate change is a problem.
Right, I guess he
So that's just completely made up. Go on.
I guess he's going to be stripped of that by the high priesthood of the IPCC one day. Dr. Sebastian Lüning holds a doctorate in geology and paleontology. For 20 years, he has worked on the refiguring of natural ecological changes in geology. So that's just the credentials of the author. And the IPCC says that a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere will cause an increase in climate between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius. Just FYI. So that's the IPCC's disaster range. And that's what all the Hollywood movies, all the media, all the idiots who parrot this nonsense are basically basing their horse shit on, is the propaganda that's pumped out by the IPCC. So they say that it's between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius. So in this book, I just want to read from a section that comes after he goes through a bunch of the different solar cycles, because the sun goes through a couple of different cycles of changing, what do you call it? A change in the
sunspots.
Yeah, the sunspot activity on the sun, exactly. And the sunspots determine ultimately cloud formation on the Earth. It's a sort of elaborate process where it's not the sun's the radiation or the heat that we feel from the sun immediately that by itself causes climate changes, but it's changes in solar radiation that have an impact on cloud formation, which end up changing the climate. And by the way, there have been ice ages with far more CO2 in the atmosphere than we have right now. Not sure where that came from, but not sure where that CO2 came from. But maybe the dinosaurs were riding around in Range Rovers. I don't know. So he writes here so after going through all those cycles, etc., he writes here that now that we have quantified the size of the link, we can proceed to estimate the effect that the sun had over the 20th century. Since the increased solar activity between the first half and second half of the 20th century is comparable to the variations between solar minimum and solar maximum over the 11-year cycle, we can expect the radiative forcing to be similar at around 1 watt per square meter. For comparison, the IPCC, that's our dear religious cult propaganda agency,
sorry, real quick, for anyone who doesn't know, that's the International Panel on Climate Change, which is
the intergovernmental,
which is the UN's, what do I want to call it, sweet precious baby for all their climate, in quotes, science.
Well, it's everyone, the media, all the propaganda that's pumped out to scare the hell out of us, all the freak out cultist nonsense. It's all based on the IPCC's edicts, if you will. They're a group of bureaucrats and scientists who, if they don't agree, they'll just kicked off the panel. Which, if you just Google IPCC. I don't know IPCC bullied scientists or whatever, you'll find a bunch.
Look up, what was his name? Phil Jones? Do I have that right?
Not sure.
This is back in like 2011, 2012, when the head of the IPCC, one of the head dudes there was, got his emails hacked.
That was the University of St. Anglia.
Yeah, thank you. That's one of the places where the IPCC gets a lot of their research from. And within there, he admits to hiding data and wanting to influence the peer review process in order to make sure that people who disagree with the climate science don't get their papers published.
Which they did. Yeah, they did manipulate the peer. I mean, they talked about how they get rid of that annoying warming, the medieval warming and the Minoan warming periods, because they just can't have that in their pre-concluded edicts that we already had much warmer temperatures without any SUVs or CO2. They can't have that because they're such scrutinizing and elaborate scientists. You see, they're so curious about history and future of climate that they'll just erase the medieval warming period because it doesn't really fit their religion. And that was that email scandal that, well, those emails were hacked. And of course, today nobody on the media talks about it. It just didn't happen, according to, I guess, them. Okay, so going back, for comparison, the IPCC in its 2007 report estimates the net anthropogenic forcing to have been 0.6 to 24 watt per square meter. But the solar forcing that modelers typically include is only the changes in the solar irradiance, which are of order 0.1 to 0.2 watts per square meter. Okay, so the IPCC thinks that the solar variability is only between 0.1 and 0.2 watts per square meter, but the anthropogenic, they just assign a much larger relevance to. They say 0.6 to 2.4 watts per square meter.
So from 3 to 12 times more?
Yes, exactly. And, that is sort of how they do this. They look at, this is how much temperature has changed. The sun obviously had nothing to do with it because we only get 0.1 to 0.2 variance here. And so the rest of it was all methane and CO2. And our research here is done. But then what these guys have done in this book, and many other scientists since, in peer-reviewed science has also confirmed this, is that they understand that it's not just the solar irradiance, not just the heat that the sun radiates and that hits the Earth, but it's also the solar winds, which is basically changes in particles that are emitted into the universe and that enter the Earth's atmosphere and that have an impact on cloud formation. Okay, but anyway, to understand the climate change better, we can employ a simple box climate model, one that includes temperatures for the land, ocean, mixed layer, and diffusion into the deep ocean. We can then ask what the allowed ranges for the different climate variables are, including the coupling, sensitivity, radiative forcings, and so forth, which can consistently explain the 20th century global warming. The answer is that if we allow the sun to have contributed more than changes in the solar irradiance, we find that 20th century warming can be much better explained than present global circulation models, which exclude a large solar effect. In fact, the residual in the fit between the model and observations is twice as small. This can be seen in figure 382, and he shows a figure there that basically throughout the 20th century, if we allow for a larger role of the sun in the climate model, then we get an almost perfect correlation between the projection based on the model and the actual temperature. Meanwhile, all the alarmist projections are consistently off. They're always wrong. They're always false, and always way off, and way overestimate the disaster scenario. But after, whenever they've been proven wrong, they ignore all their past false estimates and they just come up with new future estimates based on their stellar track record, of course.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
I just got to say, if I was not in a position where I lived in a world where all this environmentalist cult crazy shit was happening and someone came to me and was like, look, man, the climate, there's two really important variables. There's the composition of gases on the planet, and there's the activity from the sun itself. And of those two variables, the composition of the gases on the planet are way more important. I'd be like, dude,
duh.
What? Are you a flat earther too? Like, what is coming out of your mouth?
Right.
Like, my level of is so low when I hear that I don't even know what to say.
It is really annoying that books have to be written and people have to, scientists who are really intelligent and who can research fundamental questions of the universe and how things work, they have to deal with this stupidity of man-made scary weather, because Al Gore said it in a movie, and Leonardo DiCaprio flies around in private jets talking about it. Just think about it. How insane is that?
I'll tell you how insane it is.
Scientists
I will tell you how insane it is.
Spend a lot of time and effort going through this shit.
Okay, so I haven't watched it, and I'm not going to because I can't handle this level of stupid. But apparently on Netflix, there has been a documentary on the Flat Earthers. And my friend made it about halfway through before he couldn't handle it anymore, and he was telling me about it. And in fact, apparently the leader of the Flat Earthers lives on Whidbey Island, which I could see from my window.
Well, you wave at him. The flat Earth stuff is a perfect example of counterintelligence.
Oh, yes.
We were talking about that earlier. After the 9/11 truth movement just started exposing all the nonsense, all the lies in the official story, in the official 9/11 report, the things they just pretend didn't happen, even though they're on camera and everyone knows it. After that movement started gaining traction, suddenly they were bombarded with flat eartherism and with flat earth nonsense. And some fell for it, I guess. Others are just shrugging at it. But I think Flat Earthers is a perfect example of a total counterintelligence operation.
Well, and I want to compare the Flat Earth thing, because what my friend was telling me about this is that apparently the way that this Netflix documentary was set up is they actually have these Flat Earthers argue with real scientists. And before the debate between the real scientists, they have it kind of a reality TV show style where they're letting the real scientist talk by himself. And I guess all the real scientists are just like, do I really have to do this? Are you kidding me? Like, yeah. Are you actually going to make me go through like Earth science for 9th graders? Like, or 3rd graders? Like, what is this? And one of the things that again, this if I get some of these details wrong, I'm playing telephone here. This is what my friend was telling me about it, but I totally believe it because I've heard flat earthers talk. Is that this guy pulled up this diagram of all the flights that were happening on Earth, and he said, "Look, none of them are happening in the South Pole. There's nothing in the South Pole. So this whole thing that there's a North and South Pole in the Earth is fake." And all the airline companies know it because there's no planes in the South Pole. Well, then it goes over to the actual scientist who loads up the website. I don't know what the website is, which shows you all the commercial planes happening on the Earth. And he opens it up and he's like, there's planes in the South Pole right now. I'm looking at him. What, like, did this guy take this picture on 9/11 when all the planes were down? Like, I don't know what else to say. That's the level I feel when I'm talking about this. The sun doesn't do anything shit.
Yeah. And let's just finish up here real quick. This fit gives a net solar contribution of 0.8 plus minus 0.4 watts per square meter. So it could be as much as 1.2. And a climate sensitivity of 0.95 plus minus 0.35 degrees Celsius increase per doubling of CO2. These values are consistent with previous determinations of the solar effect and the climate sensitivity. Summary: we have seen that there's ample evidence to prove that the sun has a large effect on the climate. This is important because it allows us to present a much more consistent picture to explain the observed 20th century global warming, one in which model predictions fit the observations much better, or at all, actually. In this picture, the sun has contributed a net radiative forcing which is comparable to the anthropogenic contribution. As a consequence, the same 20th century warming can be explained with a smaller climate sensitivity to CO2. It also implies that for a given emissions scenario, the predicted 21st century warming should be correspondingly smaller, typically around 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius for a business as usual scenario. And that is the IPCC's disaster scenario. If there's actually no disaster and everything's just perfectly fine and nobody's going to die, sea levels are not going to rise like crazy, and CO2 is not going to cause any warming. That's what this IPCC and its so-called scientists just can't have. And any information that would suggest that, they suppress proactively, and they go after people who publish this kind of stuff.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I was quiet because I was thinking that I wish the sea levels would rise and take out Al Gore's house.
Oh yeah. Which one?
the one that he purportedly has that would be underwater if the sea levels rose to the extent that he said that they were going to rise. Oh, he has many that fit that description.
Yeah, he has many.
All of them, then. I wish that upon all of them.
He has like a waterfront condo somewhere near me, I think, somewhere in San Francisco. And, I mean, he's got a bunch of properties. And apparently, in one of his Tennessee homes, his daily electricity bill is like $500 or something like that. But it's okay because he pays into he buys carbon credits from his own carbon credit scheme.
Right. So he can sell them to you later.
It's like what did they call it? Penances? What did they?
No. Oh, I know what you're talking about. Where your get out of sin free card.
Exactly. You just purchase some free sin.
I can't think of it either.
Yeah.
Wow. So both of our minds. Anyway.
Something like, it's not allowances, but I don't know, I forgot.
It'll come to one of us.
But yeah, it all fits perfectly. It also fits perfectly that the Pope is now preaching global warming freak-out alarmism, because that is going to be the new religion. That is going to be the new global religion that people superstitiously follow and parrot and not read up on, because Leo DiCaprio did it for them, they presume. And all the famous people they like on TV do it for them. And all the big media just keeps on pumping it out. And for that reason, it's like an ancient priesthood, an ancient cult that people just follow because, you know, if they don't, they'll get in trouble. And people will look at them funny.
Well, hey, at least back in the day, you got, like, burned at the stake and shit. Today...
Yeah, at least they were honest, but...
Yeah, I mean, today, like, man, if you're not speaking up about this, you're fucking weenie.
True.
Yeah, all you gotta worry about is people looking at you like...
So pathetic, man. Yeah.
So... Did you want to do one more, or should we bring it back to austerity?
One more science bit? No, I think I'm good on that.
Okay, you got your fix.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, so bringing this back to austerity, after we've pointed out how much that if we're going to regulate, and we're not here saying that, like I mentioned on the economic side, that we just need to take away all the regulations right now, and then everything will be hunky-dory. Because we've got into the fact that money itself is a regulation. However, if we're going to look at, okay, what are regulations that not only not do anything, but B, actively hinder people from doing perfectly fine stuff like building things or driving cars or eating meat or all this other stuff. Environmental regulations take the cake for screwing with everybody for no goddamn reason. And another one I want to bring up, because I really want to drive this home. And we were talking, like I was talking about with our state, in the state of Washington, where we're getting proposed this, drive per mile bullshit, or pay per mile bullshit. You will see this if you look into the zoning. You will see the Agenda 21 language written into everything. We need sustainable development. We need smart growth. There was a third one that they like to use that I can't remember.
Yeah, anything with sustainable and smart is definitely Agenda 21.
This is what it looks like in terms of building.
Because something smart is good, right?
Yes, of course.
That's the level of intelligence they assume with the people they're addressing.
Is that part of Agenda 21 is to get people out of the rural areas and into major metropolitan areas. So what they do is they crank up the regulations in the rural areas in order to do this. And so, for example, in the state of Washington, the fish are fucking sacred here. You do not look sideways at a salmon. They will throw you in fucking jail here. And I found Seattle ordinances that the city of Seattle City Lights, which owns the dam up in New Halem, Washington, which is one of the hydroelectric dams where we get part of our power. They have they get funding from the state and from the federal level to purchase properties within a certain in the Skagit River Basin and in the Tolt River Basin. I'm saying this specifically, so you can go look it up if you wanted to. I'm guessing most of the people listening to this have no idea where these places are, where they need to buy property on the river or on tributaries of the river for the purposes of cleaning it up and making sure nobody ever builds there in order to protect the fish. Now, in the ordinance, it says, all this stuff about protect the fish, protect the fish, protect the fish. And then there's this small blurb of, oh, by the way, this also fits in with the fact that we want to keep people out of rural areas and make them move into the metropolitan zones. So the zoning follows this, where I'm not sure if the whole country's like this. I'm sorry, I'm getting into specifics. There's something called where zoning goes by things like R5 or R10, which is to say if a plot of land is R5, that says you cannot subdivide it smaller than 5 acres, or if it's R10, you cannot subdivide it smaller than 10 acres, which means you can't, if you've got a 5-acre piece of property with a house snuggled up in one corner, you can't build another house on that 5-acre property, because government said so. And when I drive around out in the woods here, you'll be driving through all this R5, and suddenly you'll drive past this medium density suburb. And you're like, well, how the hell did that thing get there? And the argument is this. I actually spoke with somebody on the planning commission in the county I live in here, is good for the environment, because if we let 10 people build on 10 acres, that's going to affect the environment more. Here's that natural balance thing I was talking about at the beginning. You touched it, therefore you ruined it. But if we take those same 10 people and put them on 4 acres, even though they're affecting those 4 acres more, we've now left those other 6 acres alone. And so what this translates to, and you said it exactly right at the beginning, is those with money are able to build. So those who have the lawyer capability and the pull within the county and the money to wait for the subdivisions, wait for the short plat, and simply to be able to buy an option property, knowing that maybe 90% of it they're not ever going to be able to do anything with, they're the ones that get to build on the property next to your house where you can't build a goddamn shed because it's bad for the environment. So this is an example of the local austerity that we're talking about, where no one is allowed to do anything unless you're in the club.
Yeah, and that's why environmentalism is the new global dogma. It's such a powerful dogma. It gives you so much power whenever you wield that club of I just want to help the environment. It really is akin to the power of the Catholic Church in the medieval
I just
era.
want to save your soul. I just want to save your soul.
It's just for your own good.
Hold this rock while I throw you in a freezing lake. It's just for your soul, man.
Yeah.
You might be a witch. It's just for your soul.
Yeah, and it's for Gaia. Gaia, the earth worship. And that's where it's going. And it's a big, long, big plan. And we're marching right towards it. And all those who parrot the global warming freakout cultism, they are just feeding into it.
I got another one that's so ridiculous, it just popped into my head. This came from that same guy on the planning commission here in the county. He told me that the planning commission was approached by an environmentalist group that wants to maintain consistent canopy space in the county. You know what canopy space is?
No.
That's me saying, okay, that tree, the branch area of that tree takes up a certain area on a map. The amount, and that's the canopy space. Let's say it's 30 square feet or something, and a forest is going to cover however many hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of acres. What the proposition was is that the canopy space can't change. I mean, what? Could you even compute that? Like, what level of narcissistic ego mendacity can you have to suggest that even nature wouldn't change it? And something that crazy gets down to, you cannot cut down that tree on your property because now that's going to change the canopy space in the county.
And the climate also can't change. We must freeze the climate at the present level because it's the optimal climate, and it can never again change from here on out. That's the insanity.
Yeah.
That these people are falling for. Yeah.
But it's for the fish, it's for the trees, it's for the plants, and all you need to remember...
It's for their egos and for their power. That's what it's for.
Yeah, it is. I was being sarcastic. You nailed it.
I know.
So, Nima, do you have we keep ranting about environmentalism, and I wanted to talk about austerity, but I think we're getting the point across with the environmentalism of why that this is the back door to austerity.
It definitely is, yeah. And it's so all-encompassing, and it's so huge. It's a worldwide agenda. It's a worldwide movement, and it's so dangerous. And people shouldn't willy-nilly fall for it. They should research the claims made and be careful, because this is an attempt to whip us all into a frenzy, and it's already happened, and in part it's still happening. But whatever the planners have planned for us is not good, and it involves austerity and reducing our standard of living, and reducing everyone's standard of living for that matter. ideally not having so many living creatures on this planet. Ultimately, I think they really want to kill off a large segment of the population with austerity, and so it's something to be mindful of, something to be concerned about. Yeah,
I agree. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up here. This has been Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube, and Nima Majur of economicsjunkie.com. And we're graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. And we thank you graciously for staying all the way through with us, and we will see you next time.